Hey, I'm Jake Teren, and this is Office Hours. And today we'll be interviewing Professor Nazif Shahrani. And he's been a professor here at IU for at least 20 years, but he's been studying anthropology for more than 40, and his focus has always been in Afghanistan, where he was born. And thank you for coming on for us today.
Thank you, Jake and Dimash, for having this discussion with me.
Yeah.
And I just have to tell you that this is my 28th year here at Indiana University, Bloomington.
Wow. That's special, man. So being an anthropologist, one of the big things is going out and doing field work.
Right.
Like for you, what's been the biggest, what's been your most memorable moment doing field work?
Well, my initial field work for my doctoral dissertation was probably the most interesting and exciting thing when I was in the Pamirs of Afghanistan, in an area that's about 14,000 feet high in the top of the mountains, with the remotest part of Afghanistan at that point, probably the world in some sense, because it was stuck between then Soviet Union and China on the east and north, and then very high mountain ridges on the south side in Pakistani border. And the only access and exit area was towards Afghanistan on the west. So for me also, these are people that I had been sort of distantly familiar. I know the Kyrgyz people, and their Khan I had seen in Kabul when they had come when I was a student there. But I didn't really know them. I was fascinated by who they were. And my interest initially was just to go and take a look at these communities for a year, or it turned out to be 21 months of going back and forth. And the idea was to see how people cope with cold conditions, high altitude, and all that. But what I also found fascinating once I was there was closed borders with Soviet Union and China, that they couldn't have access to those two countries, with whom, or with people across those borders, that they had ongoing social economic relationships for a very long time, but communist regimes in those countries had essentially sealed off the borders towards them, and that they had to readjust their lives and their movements, everything. So that was the exciting part of really doing research and trying to learn how these small community of a couple of thousand people actually managed their lives in that area.
Let me ask you this as well. Was there a greater weight, because you're from Afghanistan, and doing research in your home country, which is kind of unusual for a lot of anthropologists. A lot of them go all over the place. Did it carry a lot more personal importance to you because you were focusing from your home?
Yes, I had of course read quite a bit. By the time I went back, I had been in the U.S. for about 5 years, doing my undergraduate, the last 2 years of it, and then my graduate coursework and candidacy to a PhD degree. We had read by that time that all anthropologists were Westerners who went to these exotic places and did their research. So being a native anthropologist was rare then, but it has become a lot more common these days. It has its advantages and disadvantages. The advantage was that at the time, foreigners could not have gone where I went.
Okay.
This was forbidden part of the country because of not Afghanistan, but Soviets and Chinese didn't want Westerners show up there. So as an Afghan citizen, for me, it was the good part of that. The other part is that foreigners have to learn the local language, or maybe a couple of languages. And for me, that was not an issue. I obviously spoke two of the official languages of the country, Persian and Pashto. And my mother language is in Uzbek, which is related to Kyrgyz. So for me, it was not difficult to communicate with people. One of the advantages of doing anthropology in your own native country, and sometimes even not with your own community, but a different community with your own country, is what we anthropologists call the advantage of minimal clues. Sometimes something very ordinary will not be comprehensible for an outside anthropologist. They would not know the nuances of what is going on for a long time until they become really closely familiar. For me, that was a really advantage, that I didn't have to sort of wait a long time to understand what was going on.
What were some of those?
A lot of things, really. You can be from just heating habits of people to, negotiation of marriage arrangements, to even political nuances of how people talk about government, and
Was it as simple as like the way they're eating or what they were eating?
That's right. Yes,
Yeah.
I mean, if one of the important signs of hospitality amongst the Kyrgyz is that for a honored guest, they would slaughter an animal and then present the head of that animal cooked and ready on a platter. That's very unusual, that, especially for Westerners. Later in 1975, when I went with a British film crew to make a documentary film, that became a challenge, because they probably didn't like this head of the animal. Although they were honored guests, it should have gone in front of, the film director or somebody. And I had to tell the Kyrgyz to, don't present the head to them. And you can leave it in front of me, that's okay.
Wow.
But so that they see, how it is done, but not to be flabbergasted by.
Did you see the faces of some of the...
Sure. I mean,
was there like a huge drawback from it?
It does. It takes them aback, because it's just not done in the West, and people don't expect that. So when it happens, it becomes uncomfortable in some ways. But yet, this is the epitome of honoring somebody.
Yeah. Do you eat the head, or is it just a symbol?
It's a symbolic. You really cut a very small piece, maybe around the ear or someplace, and take a bite, and then you pass it on. The idea is that they slaughtered this animal for you.
Yeah.
And that's the evidence that the head is there. Otherwise, you could, although it's very difficult to go into a butcher to get meat, because there are none in that environment, people would probably still maybe have had slaughtered animals and then had some meat kept or something. That kind of option is a possibility, and they want to make sure that it wasn't. That you were honored actually by slaughtering in your honor either a sheep or a goat. That day, that maybe a few hours earlier, and they cooked and presented to you.
Is there ever a time when a family's like, man, we have too many guests coming over and they don't have enough animals to give to guests? Or is it for every guest?
It's not, not necessarily every guest.
Okay.
The honored guest.
Okay.
Somebody that they, they think should be honored in that way. So, ordinary guests who come and go don't get that treatment.
Yeah.
But special guests do get that. And so if foreign visitors come, that obviously is special to them, and they want to be hospitable and do what is right from their own perspective. So being a native anthropologist really also means that you can actually spend less time in the field and get a lot more data compared to somebody who is not familiar. In some ways also, that's what anthropologists do, that longitudinal research, that they just don't go there and spend one, year or something and then never return. They keep returning, and every return gives you greater depth and greater rapport and establishment of better relationship with the community, that you invest time, effort, energy, and that they're willing to reinvest in you as well. So there have been a lot of advantages of that. But then, once the war started in Afghanistan with communist revolution, Soviet invasion, my research in their lives also changed. They left the Pamirs, the area where I initially met them. They became refugees in Pakistan and then resettled in eastern Turkey. So I've continued to go and do research with them. But then my own interest also broadened, not just studying this small group, but the entire country, the entire nation of what was happening to the country. The war and the war of resistance against the Soviet occupation. In the 1980s, it was called jihad. And then, of course, came the Taliban and, the 9/11 events and American intervention with NATO in the country. So I've followed through all of these, and I've done more research and continue to do more research. In fact, this fall I will be on sabbatical leave, and I'm going to return to Kabul for an extended period of time, probably all of fall semester. In the first half of spring semester, I will be in Kabul doing some research and writing, and also hopefully being helpful to some local organizations doing advocacy work and help address countries' significant and major problems at this point.
Would you say that, so you've done research in other parts of like in other countries as well, like
sure,
in
I've
Turkey
done,
and
yes,
Pakistan?
in Pakistan and also in the former Soviet Central Asia.
Okay.
I've spent a whole year in Uzbekistan doing research in the 1990s. I've frequently visited Kyrgyzstan and also Kazakhstan.
Okay.
And doing research on higher education issues in those countries, as well as Islamic movements. And was, I think, a little different than what I had, although I had thought it might be different, but I hadn't anticipated how much. One of those had to do with language. Their language has become filled with Russian vocabulary and Russian nuances of all sorts. And they've dropped a lot of the familiar terms that my Uzbek language, for example, in Afghanistan kept using. So part of the sort of surprise was that if you don't know Russian, your language is going to be a little challenged, because people have, altered basically certain aspects of their everyday communication. But there are also other changes, lack of knowledge of basic things about Islam, that they call themselves Muslims and identify themselves as Muslims, yet lack the very basic knowledge and behavior of Muslim. Those were challenging at the beginning, and their expectation that since I had lived in America for such a long time, I should be doing certain things because I'm educated and in the West and that, so I should be breaking some of the rules that they were doing themselves. So those become sort of interesting challenges at some level, because your host's expectations are different than you're willing to or able to do.
Yeah. Um, you had this really amazing, profound statement that and this was back in 2005.
Mm.
You said the current government has a pervasiveness of trust with the current people in Afghanistan.
No, it's a lack of trust, not trust.
Yeah.
It is the trust gap between the state and the people. That is an issue. They have not been able to establish that relationship of government being trusted by its own people. That, of course, was a chronic problem for the country even before the wars, that the royal family that ruled the country, they ruled over subjects, that there were no citizens, or concept of citizenship as such is still absent in much of the Middle East and Central Asia, including Afghanistan. So how do you make that transition of sovereignty-based kind of rule into governmentality, or turning the subjects into citizens? That transformation has not happened. In Europe, it happened in the 17th, 18th century. By early 19th century, that transition had happened. That church lost its sovereignty, and royal families lost their sovereignty, and sovereignty was delivered or transferred to ordinary people who were subjects under the former rules. Now they became citizens by virtue of the fact that they could now choose and elect their own rulers. Not rulers, but their own heads of state and government bodies and so forth. And that capability makes somebody transform from being a subject to becoming a citizen. Yeah. And then the whole idea of civil service and civil society comes into being, because now people can hire their own government officials, so they can elect them or hire them. And the whole idea of government becoming servants of the people, it is a whole new notion that came in Europe and continues to be evolving in European societies and here in America. But that notion is still absent in places like Afghanistan and Central Asia and much of the Middle East. And that's why this trust gap increases between the people and their rulers still. They're not doing much for their own people.
Yeah. Is this something that you felt and knew as a young child growing up, or did you only find out about this when you were doing your research?
No, I mean, the idea of some kind of organic relationship between people and their government is not too difficult to comprehend. And in fact, in a lot of these traditional societies, you have a sense of community self-governance, that they manage their own affairs. They stay away from the government so that they are not exploited, but they can resolve their own conflicts at the local level. So the idea that how could you build on this so that broader district government, provincial government, or national government could also indulge in these kinds of exercises of democratic process, as it were. Although, when you use the term democracy with a sort of Western notions of that, it doesn't help your understanding of traditional ways of fairness, justice, and decency. It makes it into a sort of procedural things that you have to have these elections and you have to do this, that, the other. And unfortunately, in a lot of those cases, elections, just like it happened in Egypt, for example, 2-3 days ago, or in Russia yesterday or the day before, all that election means is that people elect, unfortunately, and quote unquote, their own dictators. Yeah. So that's meaningless in the sense of fair government and justice and a government that is doing service to their own people. That does not happen. That sense is not too difficult, but the sort of the theoretical understanding of how things happen historically in Europe, and it hasn't happened in places like Russia or China or Afghanistan or Middle East. That comes from one's education, one's reading, and becoming familiar with theories of social change and so on. So you become familiar with a notion in much deeper level than you might have had a hunch. And it also teaches you processes and procedures for inviting positive social change in these societies.
Yeah, and when you speak of the lack of trust, it's happening a lot, even with the democracy here in America. Do we as Americans have no idea what not having trust in the government is compared to Afghanistan, or is it comparable?
No, we have. I mean, you have to remember, democratic societies have the highest level of trust in society. Mm-hmm. Between individuals and institutions, between individuals and commercial outfits and all that. One of the signs of that is credit card business. Every day you probably and everyone else receives invitations from credit card companies to apply for this card and we'll give you $10,000 credit or $5,000 credit. This is one of the signs of that trust. The creditors are confident that when somebody applies and they give them credit, that person will pay their credit. Yeah. If they didn't, they wouldn't extend you. That's why it's much harder to get these kinds of credits in the Middle East, these cards. So yes, in the United States, we value trust. We wish to be able to trust our colleagues and people we don't know, institutions we're not familiar with. But in particular, we wish to have trust in our own government. There are times where certain leaders, such as right now in the United States, shakes that trust. That makes us question whether the erratic behavior of certain leaders is appropriate, whether it'll damage that relationship of trust in society. So yes, and in the U.S., I think in the West, perhaps in general, that relationship of trust is expected and also admired. Yeah. And expected is more important, because when we see gap in trust or damage in our notions of trust, we obviously express it, and we don't feel good.
Yeah. Does fear play any part of it in Afghanistan?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, when security, trust comes into being when there is an environment of security, that people feel personally their health, their well-being, and their survival, their existence is not in danger. When there's fear that these things may not be in place, that obviously it affects everything. You cannot build relationships of trust unless there is that feeling of security. And modern day, I think people expect that government should be the one to provide that security. So when governments become corrupt, or they use force, or they use lethal means, to control and to extract and to abuse their own people, then everything falls apart. And it affects very deeply all aspects of human relationships, and particularly people or public and government relationships.
Does the rhetoric that the people of Afghanistan are still seen as subjects and not citizens,
Mm-hmm.
is that still today?
Absolutely,
Wow.
absolutely. I think the use of the notion that there are Afghan citizens is a false one.
Yeah.
The ones, it's a strongly centralized system of governance. The president, the power of president is far greater than it should be, that he can appoint anybody in the government and dismiss anybody in the government anytime he wishes. So when you have a system like that, and people make use of those powers, which they do, then they as bribes and appoint them. Then it introduces corruption into the society, and it goes on and on and on. So what you need is introducing and accepting constitutionally the notion of community self-governance. That communities should be able to govern their own affairs and manage their own affairs. At the family level is, of course, something expected, but also at the neighborhood level, village level, district level, provincial level, all of these should be able to elect their own political officers and recruit their own professional officers, whether they're judges, police commanders, education directors. When communities are allowed to do these things for themselves and not somebody from a capital appoint them and send them, when somebody from the center sends somebody, they come as rulers. They don't come as your servant. When you hire them to be the chief of police or director of your district's police, or judge, or principal of a school, they become civil servants. They come to there to serve. This is again community-based governance. In the university environment here, for example, it becomes faculty governance.
Yeah.
Well, faculty are the ones who hire other colleagues, and they elect their department heads. And the process for recruiting deans and the president of the university, all of these are based on faculty governance principles. This is what makes public university or even private universities democratic institutions, where people learn how democracy actually works on the ground. These experiences are not allowed in much of the rest of the world, unfortunately. Everything is by appointment, and everything is, you have to please somebody to be able to have a job or to get promoted, or other things. You either bribe them or ingratiate them in some form or another. So it's not your merit that counts, but it's what you can do for them.
Is this pretty widespread across the country, that desire to be to have self-governance within certain, every section, or is this something that you just believe?
No. At the local level, this is what Afghans as a whole, and maybe Syrians or Iraqis or Iranians wish to have.
Yeah, I figured.
So I don't think it's my wish alone. It's my desire to encourage these communities to adopt community self-governance, because it'll be, first of all, something that is being already practiced at the very local level. It needs to be formalized, adopted, and elevated at the higher levels within these countries, so that everybody benefits from the advantages of transforming society from rule-based and subject relationship to one that is based on management, on issues of, plain management and service to the will of the people.
Do you have a lot of faith that one day that could be the reality?
Yes, of course. I think new generations with better education, better options will ask for this, and I believe that it'll happen. I mean, the transformative change in Europe happened because people questioned the structure of the former regimes, and it took a revolution, both American Revolution here, 1776, and then 1778 in France. All of these did not happen because somebody upstairs wanted it. It's something that people at the ground came to demand. And of course, there are always the elite with sense of justice, with educated elements and so forth in society, who become advocates for such things. But advocacy without support from the ground up is not going to work very well anywhere. Even on small things that we want changed within the university environment or in the city or county requires that kind of mobilization.
Wow.
Yeah.
The thing I'd love to ask too is, with the classes that you're teaching this year or next year,
right?
Is there one thing you'd love to impart on a student after one of your classes?
Well, as a teacher, I think the very important wish that I personally have, and I suppose my colleagues share it, is we don't want to just depart facts about the world. We want to be able to provide the analytical tools, the conceptual tools, with which our students can think and do their own analysis of facts and gather those facts. And if I succeed in importing some basic, very fundamental tools of how social science works and how we can better understand the environment in which we live and work with students, and promote, I think, the idea of a discussion rather than debate on any topic. We don't want winners and losers, but we want winners in the sense of everybody coming to a better understanding through discussions. I teach basically three very, by now I suppose, taught many times, undergraduate classes. One of them, which was really started in response to 9/11 events, it's called Post-Taliban Afghanistan in the Future of War on Global Terror, in which I try to use Afghanistan as a case study of why these kinds of wars happen and what is wrong with these wars and why do they not bring about the expected results, as it were. Why are they failing, these global wars, and so forth? And what's behind this? And why did this happen in the first place? Why did Afghanistan become, sort of terror Inc. in the global sense in the 1980s, 1990s? The other two courses that I'm teaching are anthropological introduction to the peoples and cultures of the Middle East, which I'm teaching right now, and then the second one is peoples and cultures of Central Asia, which is structured similarly, but it deals with Soviet Central Asia, Afghanistan, parts of Iran, and deals really with the relationship between state society and also the fundamentals of how these societies are organized and live their lives. And those are the three. I sometimes also teach anthropology of religion.
Okay.
with focus on Islam. I have a graduate version of that, but I have done it also in the undergraduate level. My graduate seminars are varied. A lot of them are comparative. I compare, for example, Islam in politics in the Middle East and Central Asia. So we do a lot of theory of early Islamic writings on issues of state.
You know, it is really funny, but you had all the teachers that have taught me over my years of college, that have taught me how to think. They're just circling in my head right now, and I really do believe that is what professors are supposed to do for college students.
I mean, in the old days, it used to be, memorization of a lot of facts and regurgitating them. I think both technology has also made that unnecessary. You can find the facts anywhere and just Google them and you find, but what are you going to do with them? And unless you have the analytical tools and the conceptual tools that can help you make sense of them and communicate with others and analyze it for you and expand your own mind and understanding. So that's what education, college education here is all about.
Yeah.
But in a lot of other countries, I think in Asia, Africa, maybe former Soviet Union, even Afghanistan, it's still memorization. How much facts do you carry in your head, and what is that going to do anybody? Anything, anyway.
Yeah.
So we need to focus on tools. And you know the old adage, you can either feed somebody fish or show them how to fish.
And feed them for a lifetime.
Yes. If they know how to fish, they don't have to beg for anything anymore. But if you give them fish, they eat 1 meal or 5 meals, and that's after that.
It's nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well.
Okay.
Thank you again
You're
for
most
being
welcome.
on for us.
The pleasure is mine.
Yeah, I really do appreciate it.
Okay.
This was Office Hours. It was really a pleasure to speak with Professor Shahrani, and hopefully we'll have another chance to do this in the future, but we'll sign out for now.